Are you getting the error, your variable was not declared in this scope? What is this variable scope anyway? Why are you getting this error? I'm pretty sure it doesn't have anything to do with mouthwash, but I could be wrong. Well, in this lesson, we are going to talk super basically about variable scope. There's a lot of technical details that you could dive into, but in this lesson, we're going to try to explain the very basics of variable scope to help you get this error fixed. Stay tuned. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more videos like this. Roughly speaking, variable scope has to do with where you can use a variable that you have defined. So let's take a look at an Arduino program and talk about some sections. So here we are in the Arduino IDE, and we're looking at pretty much just a bare sketch. We've got some space up here, we've got a function called setup, and we have a function called loop. If I create a variable inside setup, I can't use that variable in the loop. Let me demonstrate this. So I created a variable, an integer called dog breath inside setup, and I'm trying to set the value of dog breath in the loop, but I'm getting the error, dog breath not declared in this scope. Likewise, if I create a variable in the loop and try to use it in the setup, I'll have the same issue. Let me demonstrate that. Here, I can only use the cat breath variable inside the loop. I can't use cat breath up in setup. If I create my own function and create a variable inside that function, it can't be used outside of that function. Let me demonstrate this. So here, I made a function called myFunction, and I created an integer variable called giraffe breath inside that function. If I try to use that giraffe breath variable inside another function like loop, I get that error, was not declared in this scope. Can you see how the curly braces sort of compartmentalize our variables? If I define a variable inside curly braces, I cannot use that variable outside of those curly braces. Other functions can't see the variable outside of its curly braces. They don't even know it exists. The loop function here has no idea that giraffe breath was created and initialized over in my function. Same with setup. If we tried to use giraffe breath in setup, setup has no idea that giraffe breath was already initialized in my function because giraffe breath would be out of scope in setup. Let me show you another example here. If I create a variable and then I put curly braces around it, and I try to use that variable outside of its curly braces, I get the error, not declared in scope. It's kind of like these curly braces are force fields holding in your variable. The curly braces are setting the scope of the variable. Now here is where it gets interesting. If you create a variable outside of and before a set of curly braces, that variable can get into the curly braces after it. So let's do a little demonstration here. So here we're inside the loop, and we created a variable called fresh breath. So what is the scope of fresh breath? The scope of fresh breath are within its curly braces. So we've got, it was defined inside the loop. So here's the opening curly brace of the loop, and here's the closing curly brace of the loop. So fresh breath can be used anywhere inside of the loop. So even though we have a for loop here, right here, so this is a for loop function, notice that this has curly braces right here. Fresh breath can be used inside of these curly braces. So this for loop can see fresh breath. So fresh breath can get in, but any variable defined inside this for loop couldn't get out. For example, you'll see in our for loop, we are actually initializing a variable, a counter variable here called I. if I tried to use I outside of the for loop, for example here, I would get that error. I was not declared in this scope because I'm trying to use I outside of I's scope. So I's scope is limited to those curly braces. Now let's say I added an if statement in here. So now you can see I'm using I, which was created in the for loop, inside of this nested if statement. So I can go into these curly braces and be used, but anything we created in this if statement couldn't be used outside of that. Hopefully you get the gist there. Now, what if we did something crazy? What if we created a variable outside of any curly braces? What would the scope be then? This is what we call global scope. A variable with global scope, known as a global variable, can be used anywhere in your program. Let's show a quick example of this. Here, our global variable genie breath, which has been created outside of any curly braces, can be used by any function after where it's initially defined. So we can use genie breath in setup, we can use genie breath in loop, and we can use genie breath in this user-defined function we made, my function. Now, if we had genie breath, and instead of defining it above void setup, but instead we defined it below, and then we compiled, we would get the error again. And it would say the error here is on line 5. That genie breath was not declared in scope. And that's because we've declared this global variable after it first shows up here in setup. So you want to define your global variables to be used by any function at the very top of your sketch. Now, you might be tempted to think that using global variables is the way to go, since you can use them everywhere. It seems to make things a whole lot easier. And for a really small program, yeah, you can get away with a couple global variables. But as your programs grow in complexity, you really want to try to put a kibosh on your global variable use. And there's a bunch of reasons not to use global variables too much, but the biggest argument is probably that trying to track down bugs with a ton of global variables just is extremely difficult to do. So try to use global variables sparingly. So if you're getting that error, variable not declared in this scope, think about where are you creating your variable? Are you trying to access that variable out of its scope? Kind of track down where those curly braces are. Is it nested inside some other statement and you're trying to use it outside of that? These are the questions you need to ask. Now, it may be that this lesson created more questions than it did answers. If that's the case, I highly recommend checking out Programming Electronics Academy. We have training that walks step by step through details just like this. You can check it out at programmingelectronics.com. Thanks a lot, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.